Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico's Law and Mental Health series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenters, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. Know that we do hold them till the end, and oftentimes we have more questions than we're allowed to get to, so just forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat box shortly. If you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, there will also be a link in the chat box, but in the latter portions of the talk, keep your eye on the chat box for that. Make sure you save the link if you're not going to open it right now, and make sure you save your certificate after completing the survey. We don't have access to those completed certificate surveys after the fact. The recording for this week's talk should be available on our YouTube page later this week, and the PowerPoint slides will also be accessible for people that have registered for the series later this week as well. As a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Bill Frankenstein, who will be discussing assessing substance use allegations and high conflict family court cases. But circling back to this week, I'm really excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing ethical and professional considerations for working in high profile forensic cases. This is Dr. Kevin Richards. Dr. Kevin Richards is board certified in forensic psychology. He's previously served as a forensic psychologist in the state mental health systems of Maryland and Georgia. Dr. Richards has held adjunct and teaching and training positions at several colleges and universities and provides training for mental health and legal professionals on a range of psycholegal topics. He's a member of the Georgia Psychological Association Ethics Committee and owns and operates a forensic consultation and evaluation practice, the Forensic Specialty Group. He's personally performed over 2,000 forensic evaluations, has been qualified and an expert in forensic psychology more than 200 times in state and federal criminal courts, juvenile court, and in military court-martial. He also regularly provides training for diverse groups of professionals, including psychologists and attorneys in both civilian and military contexts. In fact, he recently did an ethical component and competency evaluations for the New Mexico Forensic Competency Examiners here in our state, which brought my attention to wanting him to present on some sort of ethical forensic issue here. So Dr. Richards, Kevin, on behalf of me and the University of New Mexico, we're very thankful for you joining this series. And I'm excited to hear your perspective and profile on this, your perspective on this critical issue in ethical forensic considerations. I'll go ahead and throw it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to the folks at University of New Mexico for inviting me to do this. I've been an avid watcher of these things, but I'm happy to be on the other side of the camera. I'd like to start off by apologizing for not looking a thing like my headshot on the website. That's something I probably need to attend to at some point. Also, I realize the room that I'm in looks like I've been kidnapped and it's some sort of proof of life video. I hope that's not too distracting for anyone. Okay, so ethical and professional considerations in work on high profile cases. Okay, hold on. There we go. Here's the information for your CEs. I know Anthony just went over that a little bit. This is a slide that kind of explains it. At the end of the presentation, a QR code will pop up on your screen that you can get to the evaluation and CE situation. I believe you'll also get something in the chat box if memory serves. But this is kind of an outline of how that whole situation works. That's my bio, which you just heard. This is a mandatory disclosure. I don't have any sort of financial arrangements that are related to the content of this presentation. I'm not benefiting financially in any way from this, and this disclosure states that nobody else involved in the program has any conflict or financial stake in this presentation, or I guess how it comes out. These are my opinions and views and not necessarily those of the University of New Mexico. And then my personal disclaimer, throughout the course of the talk this afternoon, it's possible that I will talk about individuals and cases. I just want to be clear that anything divulged about individuals or individual cases is stuff that's all available in the public domain. It's all either been published somewhere, or it's been something that occurred in an open court proceeding and is part of the public record at this point. If it comes to it, and I don't think this will happen, it's possible that if folks have questions about specific cases, I might not be able to answer them, but I really don't anticipate that happening. So I never really liked ethics seminars. I know just about every state has a requirement that you get some sort of ethics training to keep your license current. The states that I'm licensed in all have it. And those made me anxious. And it was because most of the seminars that I went to were about complicated and confusing rules to keep straight, kind of changing ethical landscapes. They also were full of horror stories about things that can go wrong. I remember when HIPAA first came out, we all kind of had this idea that the HIPAA police were watching over our shoulders all the time. There was a whole bunch of seminars, very anxiety provoking, and also recitations of all the ways that you can get in trouble for things that you may or may not be doing wrong, that you may or may not even realize. So when I'm talking today, I really don't want to I'm not going to be prescriptive at all. The reason that I'm doing this talk, it's something that I started thinking about a while back. And it's interesting because I ran it by a colleague. I said, I'm thinking about doing a seminar on ethics that has to do with high profile cases. I said, what do you think? And they said, I think it'll be a short seminar. And so I guess an hour is a good spot to try and do something like this. And the reason I started thinking about it, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, is that I noticed that high profile cases seem to have kind of a special place for a lot of folks when they talk about themselves and talk about their practices. And when something like that comes up and I notice it, it's my nature to question and start thinking, well, what is this about, right? So what I'm hoping to accomplish today, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the general relationship between ethics codes, specialty guidelines, in terms of analyzing and thinking through potential ethical issues. I'd also like to talk about identifying and assessing biases that can become issues in these high profile, and I put high profile in quotes because that has a different definition. I mean, some are obvious, but some we'll talk about in a second. The way that you think about high profile cases can vary. So what's high profile maybe in one context might not seem that in another. But I think that there are biases that can arise and that these are the things that can lead to sort of ethical challenges when we're talking about these high profile cases. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about strategies to ensure ethical practice in high profile cases. And a lot of that will have to do with what's called debiasing. I'll circle back around and I will talk about ethics codes and specialty guidelines a bit today. But what I want to do is talk about strategies that we can use to kind of mold our thinking about the way that we function when we take on these kinds of cases. Now, what I don't want to do today is kind of rain on anyone's parade. I'm not implying by doing an ethics seminar about work on high profile cases that I think anybody is doing anything wrong, or I think that the way people that approach them or talk about them are necessarily doing anything wrong. I was pretty careful when I did this not to list cases or mention cases that I knew anybody had anything to do with that I was aware of. Because I don't want to give the impression that this talk was sort of brought on by any particular case or any particular person. It's really just something that I've been thinking about over several years and has kind of come to my attention. And I started thinking about whether there were possibly some issues about that people hadn't considered. So this is not about any particular situation. There's not a particular case or a particular scenario or a particular thing that I was thinking about when I started putting this together. It's more about the general approach to these kinds of cases and how we as forensic professionals think about them and talk about them actually and tell people about them, and whether we kind of list that in our bio or put it on our CV. I know some people do and some people don't. I'm not saying there's anything wrong or right about it one way or the other. What I'm saying is I think, like with a lot of things, it's important to think about how we think about them and why we do what we do. So again, not about anybody in particular. What my focus today and what I hope to accomplish today is to talk about a way to think about and evaluate our approach to these things and whether or not there are potential traps or biases that we could fall into kind of unconsciously while we proceed working on these kinds of cases. I'm also not going to tell you the answers. As I said, I don't want this to be prescriptive. I want to talk about how we think about the issues. I don't want to have a punchline at the end where I say, well, here are the things that you should do. I will talk about some debiasing strategies that have been found empirically to be effective. So those might be some things that you take away from it. But I don't intend to kind of come up with sort of any sort of bottom line about this, about how people should function in these things. I'm more interested in how people think about them. And it is important to examine our decision-making processes. There are a lot of things going on that we don't even realize we're doing and thinking about when we're assessing situations. And what I'd like to do today is kind of really break out the process in as much as I can in an hour of how decisions get made and how we approach and think about and posture ourselves when we're taking on cases that are high profile. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship of the ethical principles and the specialty guidelines, but my position is that it's really, the answers aren't all in there, and that it's less important to kind of do, a control S search of, or a control F find in the ethics or specialty guidelines to get the answers to these questions. It's more about how we think about them. So what is a high profile case after all? Everybody probably recognizes the folks in this slide. For those of you that don't, that's John Wayne Gacy there on the left. Charles Manson's a pretty recognizable guy. Richard Ramirez was the Night Stalker in California. And of course, Ted Bundy in his familiar business suit in court. And folks recognize these. Everybody's heard about these cases, right? I don't know if there's anybody in the group that worked on any of these cases. As I said, if so, it's not about anyone in particular. But I think if we've tried to come up with a working definition of a high profile case, typically they're cases that are shocking or disturbing. They're the kind of things that kind of everybody hears about. And the interesting thing is that as we do forensic work, there's a lot of cases that we get that are shocking and disturbing. I remember in the years that I worked at the Maximum Security Hospital in Maryland, pretty much all of the cases that we got were complicated. A lot of them were shocking and disturbing, but kind of the difference is media attention. Because even the most shocking and disturbing case may or may not attract media attention. And the media attention could be national media or it could be local media. I know if you're in a smaller community, it's possible that some sort of shocking or disturbing case may happen and it may become high profile in your individual community while not garnering any national attention, or it could be the other way around, where you're in a bigger metropolitan area. And because something shocking or disturbing happens and the local media is pretty extensive, it could get picked up as a national case. And we'll talk about some reasons why that is as we proceed. I think also people think about high profile cases because for whatever reason, if we get involved in them, it's perceived as having sort of a high stakes outcome. It's the kind of thing where they may feel some pressure because there's going to be a lot of eyes on the outcome of the situation. So shocking and disturbing, increased media attention, and possibly high stakes outcomes. So why do people get so excited about these kinds of cases? And this is kind of where my thinking started about this type of evaluation and what kind of issues might be associated with them. I think one of them is professional prestige and perception. I think that perhaps folks believe, possibly rightly, that there's some comment on their particular prestige or skills if they get asked to do a case like this. I know sometimes people get assigned them. When I worked at Perkins, if a case came through and it happened to have garnered a lot of media attention, it was really more a function a lot of times of whether your number was up or not. But I think in private practice, there is a perception that if you get the call about a case that is somewhat high profile, it might be a comment on the level of trust or prestige that you've reached in your career. And I feel that way when cases come through. That's not an unusual thing. I think there's another one, and I don't think a lot of people are terribly focused on this, but it's a potential kind of pitfall. I think that's the issue of notoriety. I think the idea of being known as the person that worked on X case could potentially be a draw for some people. I think that's fraught with problems because if you make the situation about yourself and the way people think about you as opposed to the case, I think you're asking for problems. I think that can lead to issues as well with public statements and media and so forth. But I don't think that's as big of a one, but I suspect some people think about them in that way. The one that I think is curiosity, and I'm guilty of this. I originally had that less as curiosity, and I had voyeurism in there, but I thought that was a little bit too strong. But what it boils down to is people do get curious about these kinds of cases. I think in talking with colleagues about cases that I've done, where I know there's media attention, where I know that people are focused on it, I've always said, well, I'm glad I got referred this case because I'm kind of interested in what this person has to say. And so if I've seen a lot of media about a case and I happen to get a call and somebody asks me to work on it, there is a kind of a curiosity factor, and that's normal, right? People get interested in stuff like that, and people want to know what the story is and the behind the scenes situation. So, however, thinking about cases that you've done, the ones that are the most challenging or have been the most problematic or distressing or complicated or have caused the most uh, consternation or difficulties for you, are they always the ones that are the ones with the media attention? Sometimes the ones with the media attention are kind of simple, and the super complicated ones are the ones that nobody ever hears about. Or there could be a case where a case starts off as not being particularly noteworthy, but ends up being noteworthy by the time you're done with it. I bet nobody knows who this is. This is a young man named Damian McElrath. And this is probably the most complicated case that I've worked on in quite some time. This is a case that was sent back for several appeals. There were a lot of complicated legal issues, a lot of ups and downs with the psychological issues, changes of attorneys. The case itself was shocking and disturbing, but it didn't really garner any media attention. It became high profile in a way that had nothing to do with me. Later on in the course, some of you may have heard of this fellow recently. There was a pretty high profile legal decision that came down about him. But the point is, this is not anything anyone's ever heard about, but this case was actually more complicated than a lot of the cases that I've gotten that have garnered a lot of media attention. Some of those are really straightforward. So let's talk about potential risks associated with taking on high profile cases. And as I said, I think earlier, I think a lot of it comes down to keeping a check on biases, because once there's a case that gets a lot of attention, people start thinking about it, I think, in a different way. And biases, which are unconscious, as we know, but can be examined, can lead, I think, to ethical problems and possibly other potential pitfalls in terms of the way that we function in the context of these cases. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward as well. So in what ways should a case be approached differently? And this is one everybody's probably saying, not any kind of different way. And that's right. A high profile case should be approached in the same manner as any other one. And the additional scrutiny shouldn't mean additional effort. We should all handle all of our cases with professionalism and integrity. And think about these things for a second, because I'm going to come back to them in a little while. we're looking at this slide and we're saying, well, gee, Kev, these things are all pretty obvious. These are things that all of us recognize, and they're things that have kind of been, you know, drilled into us in our training and supervision earlier in our careers. And there are things that we know at an intellectual level when we think about all of our cases. But are they things that still, you know, maybe get not attended to in the way that we think we should, as we're just kind of looking at them? The slide looks kind of obvious, but I'm going to come back to this again in a few minutes. And of course, no case is small for the defendant or the victim. You know, even if a case isn't high profile and doesn't garner a lot of attention, it's certainly the most important case for whoever it is you're working with. I know all of this seems kind of obvious. Bear with me. Well, let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about ethical decision making. And I think a lot of times when people think about ethical decision making, they think immediately about consulting a reference or source like the EPPCC, our ethics code, um, and I think that's, you know, that's an important thing. But in this article that I read and cited here by Kitchener and Kitchener, they talk about the idea of whether necessary or not following whether necessary following AP ethics codes is laudable, but simply following them is not sufficient for general ethical behavior. And I think, again, this might seem kind of obvious, but I think a lot of times folks kind of default back to trying to find, you know, whatever 3.01 or whatever as kind of where the answer is. But it should be obvious to everybody that that's not really something that always works out for us. So following ethics codes is laudable. Simply following them is not sufficient. And Kitchener go on to say, and this is a question that came up years ago when I was an intern. There was a talk that we had, and it was an ethics talk. It was a younger professional, and his position was that the ethical principles are irrelevant. Now, I think that was an attention grabber, but it kind of boiled down to looking at and thinking about it in the way that Kitchener and Kitchener did, talking about whether professional codes of ethics are really needed over and above general rules like don't hurt others, don't steal, don't break promises, and so on. Is there a specific function or logical justification for a code when things like this should be simple enough, hypothetically, to evaluate ethical situations if you break them down to kind of their bare bones? You know, again, things like don't hurt each other, don't steal, don't break promises, looking at you know, state licensing things. There's, you know, consistent stuff that is not okay to do. But I think if we think about things, it's maybe not necessary to have a reference so much as think about what the underlying questions are and the underlying ways that we think about how to solve problems that are ethical. I think this is another interesting quote that kind of drives my thinking on this sort of thing. And this is from Bursoff. I'm trying to move. My slides are blocked by there we go. Back in 2008, where he talked about the function of ethical codes and ethical principles. And he talked about how the idea that a code of ethics should serve as a guide to resolving moral problems that confront the members of the profession that promulgate it, with primary emphasis on protecting the public and the profession it serves. It should be a grand statement of overarching principles that earn the respect of that public by reflecting the profession's moral integrity. That sounds great. And I think if folks think about the ethical principles, they think, well, that's probably what we did when these were developed. Okay. And again, not knocking the ethical principles. They're very helpful. I'm on an ethics committee. We refer to these things all the time. But I think Bursoff's position is worth thinking about when he goes on to say that realistically, what a code of ethics does is validate the most recent views of a majority of professionals empowered by their colleagues to make decisions about ethical issues. Thus, a code of ethics is inevitably anachronistic, conservative, ethnocentric, and the product of political compromise. But the recognition of that reality should not inhibit the creation of a document that fully realizes and expresses fundamental moral principles. That's kind of a harsh thing to say, but let's think through it. I mean, people say similar things about the DSM, that is it, is the DSM really the kind of the diagnostic Bible, or is it a result of several compromises? Is it, something that was put together by a committee that, reflects, personal biases and so forth? Or is it really driven by, empirical studies and the fact that things change with the times? Is that, a good thing or a bad thing? And I think a similar thing can be said about ethics codes without dissing or tossing out the ethics code. What I'm trying to get people to do is think about it. Okay. Um, Next slide. The specialty guidelines are another source of information that people use when they're trying to get information about how to behave within professional and ethical bounds. And I kind of respect the the text here in the specialty guidelines that talks about how these are kind of general or conceptual guidance in circumstances that arise. The guidelines do not exhaust legal, professional, moral, and ethical considerations that inform forensic practitioners, because no complex activity can be completely defined by legal rules, codes of conduct, and aspirational guidelines. Well, that's more in line with kind of where I'm going with this, and less in line with kind of the sort of simply consult the guide or simply consult the code. And the next slides, we're going to talk some about how we think about these things. So how do you think about potential ethical issues? And I've already kind of made the point numerous times that it has to be about more than looking up what the answer is in some sort of, treatise or text. If it was easy as doing that, then we wouldn't have disagreements. We wouldn't have what we call ethical dilemmas or ethical conflicts, and we probably wouldn't need ethics committees like the one that I'm on. I've been on the Georgia Psychological Association Ethics Committee for about 6 years now. And it's amazing how complicated the questions can get, and how, a large group of pretty smart people can really have a difficult time when presented with a really unique situation. And even when we comb through the your EPPCC, or even when we look at specialty guidelines, or even if we have debate and discussion and draw on our experiences and on the cases that we've done in situations that we've encountered, some of these things are still really tough, right? And so that's when I think we have to back up and think about how we think about, and we have to kind of focus less on the answer and more on the journey or the way that you got there. So let's talk a little bit about biases. In high-profile cases, I think unconscious bias has an increased potential to create a situation that could possibly give rise to an ethical question or problem. And again, I think these things are very case specific, and really thinking about biases is a thing, I mean, we obviously should always be doing, but I think we need to be able to sort of think about the way the biases could enter into it, think about the connection and the ethical implications, and then kind of find out or examine our own thinking about a situation, or examine our own behavior about a situation, and go back and think, well, was I somehow impacted by some aspect? Or was, as I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, my thinking contaminated by situations that are associated with a complex case or a high profile case? And did that introduce some kind of a bias? And is that problematic in terms of the way that I worked this case compared to other cases that I've done? Again, talking about Damien's case just a few slides back, extraordinarily complicated, but not really any pressure when I was working on it. And I said it became kind of accidentally high profile, but it wasn't the way that it started out. So what are some potential biases that can come up in high profile cases? I think the obvious one is confirmation bias. And I think this can come from a number of sources. I think if one has been watching news stories about a particular case for a number of days or weeks, and then suddenly the phone rings and it's the attorney, and the attorney says, I'm sure you've probably heard about this case, but now I want you to come and do an evaluation of my client, who is the person who's the subject of this. What does that do? How does that impact the way that we think about these cases? You know, is the fact that we've been exposed to such media going to somehow unconsciously direct the way that we think about them? Or is it possible that what we know about it kind of tweaks some sort of internal feeling or internal moral conviction, or something about the way that we think about these cases? You know, some of them tend to have really kind of lurid details. And I think that even as forensic professionals that are kind of used to being around this kind of stuff, that evokes reactions in people, right? So it doesn't necessarily just have to be about what the media is feeding you, and it can come from inside. And it's also important to recognize that what the media is feeding you is what they can get their hands on. So as those of you that have worked on cases that have garnered some sort of media attention, you almost always find out there's another story behind the story. But I wonder if we're kind of primed to look at these things in a certain way, and how we have to kind of detangle our thinking and kind of go back retrospectively and think about what the influences were on our thinking prior to taking the case, and how maybe that impacts the way that we think about it or behave in the conduct of the evaluation without maybe even recognizing it, or in some way justifying handling it in a different way, because of external pressures or so forth. Affiliation bias is another one. And again, you know, if you are a person who's, let's say, working in private practice, and you are the person that gets tagged to do a case like this, and it's attorney that you've known for a while, is it possible that the increased pressure and notoriety could somehow impact your unconscious desire to maybe come up with something that's consistent with the formulation that's provided to you by the attorney? Because those calls always come with an explanation. It's rarely an attorney calls me and says, hey, I'd like you to work on a case. I'm not going to tell you anything about it because I don't want to impact your thinking. What do? They tell you, well, here's the case, and here's what we think, and here's all the factors that we think are important. And again, at an intellectual level, all of us are thinking, well, gee whiz, all of us know about affiliation bias and confirmation bias, right? So these are not things that are probably going to impact our thinking. But I think if I'm being honest with myself and looking back with the way that I've handled some of these cases in the past, I'm not saying confirmation or affiliation bias, but sort of those pressures, and particularly this third one, the Hawthorne effect, which is the idea that we behave differently when we're being watched, are all things that could potentially have impacted. I don't think in cases that I've done that have been high profile, I've done anything necessarily, even when I detangle it in the way that I'm going to talk to about in a few minutes, done anything unethical. I have to go back and say, well, you know, I probably did think about these cases a little bit differently. I probably did have to work a little harder to keep a check on my preconceived notions about what the case is about, or who the attorney was, or who referred the case to me. And I probably was a little bit maybe more careful. I don't know. Again, not in an unethical way, but you know, if we're all being honest with ourselves, maybe there are some things to this. And I think when we know we're being watched, and when we know there's going to be, you know, a reaction to whatever our opinion is when it comes out, maybe good or bad, then we're going to be conscious of that. I think in high profile cases, sometimes if we get particularly kind of wound up when we do a case, we think it's going to be one thing, and then we come up with an opinion that maybe we didn't expect, or maybe an opinion that we know is going to be unpopular, for lack of a better word. Um, you know, I've talked to colleagues before that have encountered this, where they've been involved in very high profile cases, and they come up with an opinion that is not in line with sort of the mainstream thinking about the case, or certainly with the way the media has been dealing with the case. And that can be a difficult thing to deal with. It can be a difficult thing to overcome when you're mired in one of these cases. When I talked before about how we all know that you know, there are things that are basic and important, in terms of doing all cases the same and so forth. We're of course aware of that. But there's a thing, and I talked about how these biases can come up. And again, this is one of the reasons that I think kind of detangling or examining our actual thinking about these cases is so important. And that is the idea of a bias blind spot. There was an article that came out in 2002 that examined this. And what they found is that people are much better at spotting bias in other people than they are in spotting their own. Interestingly, in their study, they had, you know, it was a series of studies that were done for the 2002 article. But the interesting thing is that participants, reported their peers' self-serving attributions regarding their performance on the tests they did to be biased, but their own similarly self-serving attributions to be free of bias. So in evaluating other people's behavior, they identified biases real easily, whereas looking at the same objective set of circumstances resisted the idea that their own behavior or their own conduct in the situation could potentially be biased. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because again, we have these general ideas about what we should be doing and how we should be conducting. And we probably are pretty confident, or, maybe defensive, but confident's a nicer thing to say about our ability to overcome these things. My position is that maybe we're not so good. And I think the idea of something like the bias blind spot, it informs this, in that our own self-evaluation is likely to be different than the way that we would evaluate other people, maybe even in a very similar circumstance. So it's an important thing to keep your eye on. Neil and Brodsky did a study about biases in forensic evaluations back in 2016, and they talked about the bias blind spot in terms of people that do forensic evaluations. And what they talked about, and I talked about introspection, is that people tend to use introspection to assess their own potential bias. They tend to believe that they're able to kind of evaluate their own behavior and their own thinking in an objective way, and would absolutely kind of be able to identify their own potential biases just by using introspection or kind of thinking about, what they believe to have been their behavior. However, they tend to focus on behavior when assessing the same issues in others, which is kind of consistent with the bias blind spot article, the original one from back in 2002, is the idea that our attributions of our own bias or our own potential for bias are going to be more self-serving. And it even boils down to the way that we gather information about whether we're being biased versus whether other people are being biased. And it leads to the question in my mind of, maybe if we were kind of looking at behavior as opposed to introspecting, I wonder if it would come up the same way in terms of the things that we perceived as being potentially biased behaviors, but we might have a harder time recognizing it. So they talk about the idea of de-biasing. And there are strategies that have been shown empirically to be effective in de-biasing. And these are educational strategies, some examples, educational strategies that focus really concretely on human decision-making and what can go awry. Now, well, I'll come back to that in a sec. Another one, and these kind of come out of other domains, other occupations, but the idea of slowing down, of kind of going back over things, kind of doing things in slow motion to make it possible to kind of break down our thinking into smaller chunks, as opposed to kind of looking at an overall thing, but slowing down, going over things. There were some very concrete things in there about, not when you think you've come to an answer, kind of go back and look over it again. Don't rush, don't believe that on the first pass you're going to get the answer. Kind of go back and think about what you think about, and then maybe argue with yourself a little bit before deciding that you finally come to the answer. And that if you are willing to do that and kind of actively look at these alternate perspectives, it's possible that you could identify potential problems. And a third one is using structured evaluation methods. I think, this is a thing that we have found to be effective, diagnostic interviewing. I think it's kind of given rise to the, forensic assessment instruments that we use in a lot of our cases. And it's a way to protect oneself from, behaving differently in one case than you would in another if you kind of have a way of approaching cases. And obviously, we don't approach every case in the exact same way. But if we have sort of a structured outline, a structured way of approaching cases that we apply sort of objectively, no matter what the case is, whether it's trespassing or whether it's a high profile multiple murder situation. Then they identified some things that don't work. And the number one thing they identified that doesn't really work is introspection. And again, if we think about this, this makes perfect sense because of the bias blind spot studies, the idea that we're not very good at recognizing things in ourselves and that we don't tend to focus on our behavior as much as sort of our internalized, easy for me to say, kind of view of our own ability to handle these things and our own ability to avoid biases. The other thing that doesn't work is training that simply teaches us to avoid bias or be objective. Now, if you'll think back to that slide that I presented several slides back that says, you should handle every case the same and no case is small for the person that's involved in it. And we shouldn't do anything additional or different when we're doing working on high profile cases. It's possible that training at that level of examination is not necessarily going to be particularly effective in eliminating biases, because I think if we look at those things, those sort of general kind of broad stroke principles, we can say, well, of course, those are really obvious, right? I even said that when I showed you the slide a few minutes ago. But what do? We go back and use kind of our introspection powers, which are ineffective, and we kind of decide, oh, well, I can follow those things. But what they found is that training that really focuses concretely on the way that we make decisions. And there's a whole fascinating literature about this and what can go awry. And I'm going to talk about one of those studies in just a minute to kind of talk about one method that people have come up with for sort of decontaminating or debiasing their thinking about situations. And this applies in any situation, but I think we can apply it to our work in forensic psychology, and particularly in our work in high-profile forensic cases. So this is an article, I know I just keep going backwards, from 1994 about mental contamination. I think it was in Psych Bulletin. So it was very long, very dense, very interesting. But they talk about the concept of mental contamination. And they sort of, back in 94, were sort of using a model that was similar to the way that we think of contamination, disease, how kind of external invisible influences impact our thinking much in the same way that invisible influences can affect, our health, the quality of our food supply, or anything that has the potential to become contaminated. They talk about the idea of mental contamination. And over the course of the article, they outlined a process where you can look at your thought processes to seek out and eliminate whether or not your thinking is becoming contaminated. I think this is something that we can apply to kind of seeking out biases when we're looking at our forensic work. And this is, of course, cited in some of the other articles about biasing and debiasing as sort of being some of the seminal work that made people start thinking about these things. So I apologize for this slide. This is from the Wilson, and it's copied from the Wilson and Brecky article. I did not make this slide. I'm talking about somebody else's idea. I want to be clear about that. However, it was also very hard to fit into one PowerPoint slide. I think it shows up reasonably well in the presentation version that I'm showing you right now, but I apologize if people have a hard time looking at it. So let's start at the top. And the idea that some sort of unwanted mental processing is triggered, and we may be unaware of this, right? But maybe we become aware that there's a potential problem through introspection, right? Or because of some correct theory, and we think about it, and we become aware of the thing. That if that's yes, if it's no, then you can see the flow chart goes right to the side where our thinking has been contaminated. There's a potential issue. We're unaware of it. So it's possible, or at least there's a higher probability that our thinking will become contaminated. If we realize it, we move on to step number 2. Are we motivated to correct it? And if we are motivated to correct it, we're still in the game. If we're not motivated to correct it, or we look at it, identify it, aware of it, our introspection tells us doesn't apply to me, moving on, then again, you're still in a situation where there are pitfalls. So are you then aware of the direction and magnitude of the potential bias? If you are, you're still in the game. If you're not even sure how the bias could potentially affect you, or you have not thought it through, you recognize it, you're motivated to correct it, but you're not even sure how it's impacting the way that you're thinking, then again, that can lead to contamination. If you keep going further and you find a way to adjust your response to take into account the potentially contaminating influence, then it's less likely that your thinking will become contaminated and that you have applied a successful correction to the way that you think about things. I think it's a really, again, there's probably other models. I think this one is very useful, and I think this graphic is very helpful, if not a little difficult to read. Back to the high-profile cases. And again, I've been talking about unconscious biases and how they can cause us to treat these cases differently, which increases the risk of ethical issues. So now I want to move on to another, and again, not accusing anybody of anything. I'm going to talk about something that is a phenomena that has been identified. There was a term that I'm going to talk about in a sec that was coined by an NPR correspondent. Who recognizes these people? I bet maybe the third one from the left, you might have a little bit of trouble with. But that's Natalie Holloway. She's a young woman who disappeared on a high school trip several years ago from Alabama and Aruba. There's been a tremendous amount of kind of effort and media, and there's even, I think, been some documentaries about the search to find her. The second one is a more recent case. That's a young woman named Gabby Petito, who was, it seems, murdered by her boyfriend and traveling companion. There was a lot of attention to that. There was even police body cam video of interactions between them and law enforcement not long before she was murdered. The one next to that is a woman named Chandra Levy. That's a little bit of an older case, but Chandra Levy was an aide to a senator, and she disappeared, and there was a whole big whoop-de-doo about whether they were having an affair and whether he possibly killed her. And eventually her body was found, and it was not the senator, it was somebody else, unfortunately, that had murdered her. And then the last one is, this is JC Dugard. That's a picture of her when she was 12. She's the young woman who spent something like 18 years with a person that kidnapped her when she was a little girl. She wrote a book recently, but there was a tremendous amount of attention again to her case. So are there cultural considerations in whose case gets to be high profile? And are our potential biases possibly feeding into this, okay, or being affected by it? And this is something that the NPR correspondent called missing white woman syndrome. And studies have shown that the press disproportionately covers stories about young white women. As a result, a lot of the high profile cases are going to involve missing white people. This is a fascinating website that I would recommend people take a look at. I didn't invent it. I don't have a site here, which is my mistake, but it's in the public domain. You can go to that website, and it's called Are You Pressworthy? And what it will do is you'll enter some of your demographic information into it, and it will tell you the number of stories that are likely to be generated if you were to go missing. I got a 14, okay? So if I go missing, I'm, probably in trouble because studies have shown that cases that some of them don't end well as with some of the cases that I showed before, Ms. Petito or, Natalie Holloway or Ms. Levy. Their cases don't end well, but cases have a higher tendency to work out well if they get media attention, because that's how people find out about them. And that, I got a 14, I'm a 60-year-old Caucasian male. So if I disappear, I guess I'm in trouble. White women in their 20s average around 120 stories. So, is this sort of a cultural bias that is being entered into, the thinking about what is and what is not a high profile case? And I recognize that high profile cases don't always involve victims like this, but in thinking about whether or not there were any cultural considerations about high profile cases that could potentially be something that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about our approach to these, that was what I came up with. And I think it's a fascinating sort of, thought and an interesting website. If you want to come up with a something in ethics that is potentially impacted by our work and our thinking about high profile cases, I think principle D is the one. When you think of the ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct, I'm a bigger fan of the EPP part, and find that a more flexible way to guide your thinking, less of a fan of the CC, although I obviously don't disregard. I'm not dissing it. I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to it. I'm just saying that the broad overarching ethical principles maybe sometimes are flexible enough to guide kind of the way that we think. And justice was the one that I came up with. And I think, again, our potential biases, unconscious biases, that we're, as psychologists, to exercise reasonable judgment and take precautions to ensure our biases and boundaries of competence and limitations don't lead or condone unjust practices. And also that psychologists recognize that fairness and justice entitles everybody to access and benefit from the contributions of psychology and to equal quality in the process. And that's kind of what we talk about when we are talking about how we do these high profile evaluations or get involved in these high profile cases. So to sum up, and I've left a few minutes for questions. High profile cases introduce a unique set of challenges. Those of us who have been doing this long enough are inevitably going to end up with one or a number of them. Unconscious biases do have the potential to give rise to ethical concerns, and we aren't very good at recognizing our own biases, but there are ways to kind of debias our thinking. There are ways to think about whether our thinking has become contaminated. There are people doing research on this. And I think if we're willing to take a step back, and I guess this applies to any kind of an ethical concern or question, and are willing to kind of untangle the way that we actually think about things, that maybe we'll have a better sense of whether or not our behavior in these evaluations is something that we need to monitor or modify. And as I said, there are empirically supported methods of debiasing and ways to think about mental contamination that we can use to apply to our own thinking and behavior when we are proceeding with these kinds of cases. And we've got about 5 minutes. I want to give a special shout out to Rick Demir. He is the one who told me this might be a short presentation, but he was also super helpful and looked at an early draft of this. So I want to give a shout out to him. And any questions? I see some things in the Q&A, so I suspect there are some.
There certainly are. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Richards, Kevin, for that very thorough roundup of a lot of different considerations around the approach, like you're getting at with debiasing, and something that we talk about frequently here. This idea of it's way harder for us to investigate if we are biased as much as if the context or the steps that could produce bias are there. So being aware of the different things that could cause us bias more than just bias as a concept.
Right.
That's particularly helpful here. As you see, yes, there are several questions that people have. You can certainly enter more questions as for Dr. Richards as they come up, and the CE Link survey is in the chat box. Make sure you save that or check it at this point. So that you can have anything, so that you can complete the survey at a later time if you want to review that. We'll go over a couple of questions now. Somebody noted when you were talking about some recommendations, your thoughts on these strategies from Brodsky and Pope being perhaps particularly helpful. One, seeking out directed feedback, and two, providing and receiving consultation. What are your thoughts on that? And any particular thoughts on that in high profile cases?
Again, where is that? I'm looking for that question so I can read it, just to make sure I'm answering.
1147 is the timestamp. It goes in order of time.
Oh gosh, okay.
Yeah.
I got it. Two strategies might be the most effective of all. What do you think? Recommendations for reviewing draft reports, seek out directed feedback. Is that the one? Seek out directed feedback, provide, receive consultation.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are, when I was talking, I'm talking about sort of debiasing strategies kind of at a bigger level in terms of the way that it impacts our thinking. Practically speaking, yeah, those are all things that can certainly help. And I think saying seeking out directed feedback and providing and receiving consultation are certainly important things. But what we know about the way that the kind of training, supervision, consultation is going to be most effective is that most specifically addresses the way that we think about these things. So I think as a supervisor, it would be the kind of thing where it would be really helpful to take your supervisee and instead of kind of giving them sort of a general or a more broad overview of how biases can impact things, to help them drill down on the way that they think about them. It's more complicated and it's going to be a little bit different in a lot of situations. But I think if you have sort of an overall way of thinking about biases and thinking about how we think about biases and how we think about ethical questions, that's really the key. So these things, of course, these things are helpful, but I think that the key is that they have to be very kind of specific about how we think about things and how our thinking can be affected, as opposed to just, giving feedback on how we, should always do things kind of the same. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure that it did, but.
There's a follow-up from a practical standpoint that somebody asked a little bit later, where they asked about, do you have recommendations for how to obtain consultation with colleagues in a high profile case to maintain some confidentiality, as in before your involvement in the case goes public? Any considerations there?
Yeah, that's a tough one, honestly. And it's funny because the idea of kind of going public is something I've struggled with in some cases before. And I think it's really one of those situations where all of us need people. I mean, it's hard, particularly when you're in private practice, to be kind of an island. I think it's important to have, a kind of a cadre of colleagues that you can go to with these sorts of things that are not going to get, maybe caught up in the sort of the drama or the, I don't know, the kind of curiosity pieces of it. I know in my own practice, I have a number of people. I've been doing this a long time. I have a number of people that I trust enough that I know have worked on these kinds of cases before, that are willing to kind of talk through them with me without wanting to kind of ask me a lot of questions about sort of the lurid details or the things like that. There was a case I was involved in very recently that was it's a case everybody's heard of, but it was one of these things where I was really struggling. I was a little concerned about going public or being kind of outed as the person that was working on the case, because I'm not really that comfortable with media attention. So I think it boils down to that. And I know that can be, that's easy for me to say. I've been doing this for over 30 years. I think if you're maybe a little bit of an earlier career professional, it can, possibly be worthwhile to maybe seek out some folks, seek out somebody who's who has done, a ton of these kinds of cases, and see if they'd be willing to talk through things with you. Because the idea is that you really need somebody to say, hey, here's a case I'm doing. I've got this set of test data. I've done a certain amount of interviewing, and this is kind of where my thinking is going. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything, without having to kind of go, oh yeah, well, here's all the details that the media hasn't told you. So, I mean, that sounds kind of basic, but I think that's really the key. It's a matter of, having a resource, having somebody. And like I said, that can be hard when you're earlier on in your career. The folks that are in my practice come from very diverse backgrounds. All of them have had cases that have been higher profile or lower profile. But I think we've come to a trust in our small group of being able to talk about cases without kind of getting bogged down with some of the specifics, and being able to kind of stay focused on the process to make sure, that what I need, which is making sure I'm not missing anything, making sure I'm not behaving differently, making sure I'm not, conducting the evaluation in a different way than I would if it was just, something that was didn't have any notoriety is really, and I don't know if that is, specific enough for you, but that's kind of the way that I do it.
Thank you for that. And in terms of being aware of what information you're going to be speaking of in a high profile case that gets out there, somebody asked, can you talk about testifying about feigning measures in high profile cases with respect to balancing of upholding our ethical obligations of maintaining test security and trade secrets while still answering relevant questions about how the test was used in a particular case?
Okay, I will try. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure how it would be different. I guess I'm a little puzzled by the question. I'm not sure how it would be different than in any other case. I mean, obviously with a case, the case being televised, talking about feigning measures, um, there's probably in high profile cases also there's gonna be more pressure to, turn over your test data, turn over your notes, turn over everything that you've done. And certainly that does raise the specter of some sort of test security ethical obligation. Um, Again, it almost seems like a question for another seminar, but in high profile cases, I will tell you, I kind of deal with it the same way that I always do. And I would be interested to hear what other people think, whether there's some way of something that is different about a televised case that would lead to increased risk of problems with test security or trade secrets, possibly because a larger number of people would hear the testimony. But I think, if it's an open hearing, even though it'd be a smaller number, there still would be a potential for people to hear maybe more information about these things, depending on how the attorneys question than we'd be comfortable with. But again, I'm not sure there's anything that I would do differently necessarily. Again, it kind of goes back to the idea that, you treat that case like you would treat any other case, even if there's only one other person in the courtroom. Our responsibility with regard to test security and ethical obligations, remains the same. And again, if I've not answered that particularly well, I'd be happy to, talk some more with, anybody specifically. I don't know if you provide contact information. I'm certainly happy to, talk through these things with folks that, want to examine their own thinking. But again, hope that was a halfway decent answer.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. I do have a couple of people have asked about access to the CE survey. You want to say the link is working. If it's not working for you right now, make sure that you copy, bookmark that. Here's the QR code to try a direct scan. Trying a different web browser can also help. We have triple, quadruple checked it on external sources and all that. It is active and operating right now. Somebody else asked, in a high profile case, do you watch or avoid coverage of the case? Do you watch the trial if there is one? How do you approach all those other aspects of the case?
I think, it's sometimes it's difficult to avoid, right? But I will say for my own part, I try to make sure I keep a strong sense of the idea that it's not about me. So if, let's say I do something involved in a case, and whether I testify or don't end up testifying, I really don't follow the cases particularly closely in excess of what I need to do the case. But that's not kind of something I'm going to learn from CNN. So I think it's important to keep a kind of an appropriate distance, and make some efforts to stay away from issues that could potentially bias. We talked about earlier on in this presentation how one of the issues with high profile cases is the idea that they have media attention. And, I think if you've ever done one of these, I mean, I know we all know the media does what the media does, in terms of trying to get listeners or viewers. But anybody that's done one of these cases typically finds out there's way more to it than what is on the surface. And in the particular case that I'm thinking about, I think people have a lot of preconceived notions about what the case is about. And if I had been sort of willing to kind of go along with that, or sort of adopt the kind of the media thinking about the case, then I'm sure it would have had the potential to contaminate my own thinking about it. If I went into it thinking, oh, this is a case about X, and when I got into the case, I really found out that it was a case about something else that folks don't really even realize. So I think it's important, once you've identified yourself as being part of it, to maybe shut that down a little bit, and try and insulate your own thinking to to yourself, to your trusted colleagues, and kind of actively engage in these, de-biasing investigations with your own thinking and your own behavior, to make sure that you're not doing anything that you wouldn't do in any other case, just because it's something that's, got some notoriety, or that's, lurid, or attracted a lot of attention on the TV.
We are short on time, just to wrap up with one final question here from a member of the media, as they said, and they're asking, what advice would you give someone who's approached by media to talk about court processes in general, or about a particular case?
I usually disappoint them, because I mean, I think I have a really good face for radio, so I'm not real anxious to get on the TV anyway. But I think that it's just asking for trouble. I have been approached by the media. I've gotten unsolicited calls from people that I didn't even knew I was working on a case. I typically turn them down. I'm not usually interested in, I'll talk about general court processes, and I'd be willing to talk about how these things, how things work, sort of in a vacuum, or without referring to any specific case. But when it comes to cases that I'm working on, I think, if you wanted to go and find something in the the practice guidelines, I would look at the stuff about public statements, because again, once you've said something to the media, you lose control of it. And it's possible, and if this is a member of the media, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings or anything, but I have been quoted out of context before. I got invited to do some stuff for some, documentary a while back, and gave like an hour-and-a-half interview, and there was like 3 minutes of sound bites, and I thought I sounded like an idiot, so I said I would never do it again. So I think it's just fraught with problems. I think I'd be willing to talk generally about a process, but I don't think I'm ever going to be interviewed, even when a case is over, even if they know that I'm involved in it. I'm just not going to be interested, just because I think it's just fraught with problems.
Kevin, Dr. Richards, thank you so much for covering a lot of considerations for any of us who may encounter a high profile case, giving us a lot to think about, a lot to anticipate. A lot of it, again, comes back to the fundamentals of how we would approach a case in general, and then, being in a high profile case. So for that reassuring part in particular, very grateful to you. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week, when Dr. Bill Frankenstein will be discussing assessing substance use allegations in high conflict family court cases. Until then, the copy of this presentation will be available on our public YouTube page. We hope to see you next week for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.